All right, let's begin. So today we have a short lesson, just a single topic here on solving equations using factoring by grouping. So we've already factored by grouping, but we never solved the equation. So we're going to go ahead and do that today, okay? So again, remember, when we're solving by factoring by grouping, we're going to go ahead and separate them into groups of two terms. So the first two terms and the last two terms. And then you just factor each section separately. So here we have x squared that we can factor out, and we are left with, remember, to factor means to undistribute. So we're left with x here minus 6. Notice if I distribute here, x squared times x, I get x cubed, and x squared times negative 6 is negative 6x squared. Okay? Now, over here, we should expect to end up with the same binomial inside the parentheses here. So we should have x minus 6 here. Okay, so notice here, what can we factor out here to end up with an x minus 6? Well, let's go ahead and get our calculator. And let's go ahead and, well, notice here I factor out an x. So if I factor out an x, that means I need a negative 13 here. Okay, so negative 13 times x will give me the negative 13x. And let's double check to make sure that negative 13 times negative 6, or just do 13 times 6 to make sure that's 78. Yes. So we know that a negative times a negative is a positive. So we can go ahead and factor it like this here. Okay, so that works. All right, now we're not done yet. We need to put these two on the outside in their separate parentheses. So this will be x squared minus 13 times x minus 6 equals 0. Okay, so that we factored by grouping, and now we have to solve. Okay, so to solve each one here, remember we did some where we have to set it equal to 0 and then solve for the variable. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to do that to both of these. So it'll be x squared minus 13 equals 0, and then x minus 6 equals 0. Okay, now for the factor here, with the x to the first power, I could just take the opposite of that number here. So the opposite of negative 6 is 6. So for this one, my answer is just going to be x equals positive 6. Okay? For this one, however, the 2 here, the degree here is 2. That tells me I can have at most 2 solutions for this equation here. Okay? So watch this. Let's solve. Let's add 13 to both sides. So I get x squared equals 13. And then I'm going to go ahead and square root both sides. Okay, the square root cancels out with the x squared, so just with the exponent I should say, and so I'm left with x equals plus or minus the square root of 13. Okay, so notice here I have a square root, but I have to include the plus or minus because whenever I'm solving for an equation that has an x squared, that means I'm going to have at most 2 solutions. So here are my 2 solutions. One's going to be a positive square root of 13, and the other one's going to be a negative square root of 13. Okay. Now from yesterday's notes, remember, we want to simplify this. So let me go ahead and write quickly my perfect squares. Okay, so it's going to be 1, 4, 9, 16, 25, 36, and go ahead and copy these down too. 49, 64, 81, 100, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 11 is going to be 121, 144, and then we said 169. Okay, and so notice here, the square root of 13 would be, well, the 13 would be after the 9 here, and notice we can't divide 13 by any of these numbers. So that means it cannot be simplified further. Okay, so my 3 solutions, notice here, this tells us I have at most 3 solutions. So here's 1, and then here are the other 2, the positive square root of 13 and the negative square root of 13. So that makes 3 total. Next, okay, so I'm going to go ahead and group this here and here. And so here the only thing they have in common is x squared. So let's factor out an x squared. That's going to leave me with x plus, now notice here, x squared times what will give me x squared? Well, 1. Okay? So over here, I should expect to end up with x plus 1 inside the parentheses. Okay? Well, what should I factor out here? Notice, what do they both have in common? Well, they have the 25. Okay, and if it leads with a negative here, then we have to have a negative at in between as well. So this will be negative 25. Notice if I distribute, negative 25 times x is negative 25x. And negative 25 times 1 is negative 25. Okay? So let's go ahead and simplify this here. We have x squared minus 25 times x plus 1 equals 0. Remember, for this one, I could just go ahead and take the opposite because it's just x plus 1. So I just take the opposite. My answer for this one is going to be x equals negative 1. You can't do that here, okay? You can only do that when it's x to the first power. Right here we have x squared. But notice here, x squared minus 25, that should look familiar to you. That should remind you of a difference of squares. That means I can factor this further into x minus 5 times x plus 5. Okay? So now notice these are now x to the first power minus 5, x to the first power plus 5. Now I can take the opposite. So this will just be x equals 5 and x equals negative 5. If I were to write my answer here, I could just go from least to greatest. So I would just go ahead and put little braces here. And it'll just be negative 1 and then negative 5 and 5. And I didn't do it from least to greatest. Negative 5 should be first and then negative 1. But it really makes no difference, okay? Just go ahead and put all your answers inside the braces. For this one, it would just be written like this. Square root of 13, negative square root of 13, and 6. See that? Okay, let's move on. Next one here. So again, we find out what they have in common in each group. So this will be x squared times, and then I have x minus 4. So x squared times x is x cubed, and x squared times negative 4 is negative 4x squared. Okay. Now notice here, I have a plus sign here, so I'm going to make sure I put plus here. And inside parentheses here, I should have the same thing that this one has. Okay. Now let's make sure that it does work. So what can I factor out of here? Well, it looks like they have nothing in common. So if they have nothing in common, you just write a 1 outside of it. Okay. Now let's distribute, just to double check. What's 1 times x? Is that x? Yes. And what's 1 times negative 4? That should be negative 4. Very good. So simplify this. We have x squared plus 1 times x minus 4 equals 0. Okay. Now just take the opposite of this one. That'll be x equals positive 4. This one here is not a difference of squares, so I can't factor this further. So I'm going to go ahead and solve here on the side here. I'm going to say x squared plus 1 equals 0. So set it equal to 0 and solve. Okay, so we're going to subtract 1 on both sides. That's going to give me x squared equals negative 1. Okay, so now let's square root both sides. The 2 cancels out with the radical. I have x equals, now what did I say happens when we have a negative inside the square root? Do you guys remember? That was from yesterday's notes. That's right, it's just going to be I square root of 1. So the negative comes out as imaginary. Now, what's the square root of 1? You could even do this on the calculator. The square root of 1 is 1. Okay, so before I forget, make sure you put the plus or minus here in your final answer. Okay, so this will be plus or minus 1i. Or it could just be written as plus or minus I. So when 1 is your coefficient, you could just leave it as an invisible 1 and just write plus or minus I. Okay? So notice here, these are my 3 solutions right here. I have 4, and then positive I, and negative I. 3 solutions that come from the degree there, 3. Okay? Next, let's go ahead and factor it in groups of 2. And so notice here I have 4x cubed plus x squared. Let's go ahead and just factor out an x squared. And so I'm going to be left with 4x plus 1. If I distribute, I end up with this. Okay. Notice this starts with negative, so I'm going to go ahead and put a negative here. I'm going to put inside 4x plus 1 again. Okay. Now to find out what number goes out here, just go ahead and take this 60 divided by the 4 here. What do we get? 60 divided by 4 is 15. So that means we can factor out a negative 15. Now let's try that. Is negative 15 times 4x, is that negative 60x? Let's just do 15 times 4. Notice we get 60, and the negative times the positive is a negative. What about negative 15 times positive 1? Is that negative 15? Sure is. Okay, so that means that that's how I factored this. So this is going to be equals 0, don't forget that. And so we're going to have x squared minus 15 in one parentheses. And over here, 4x plus 1 in the other parentheses equals 0. Okay? Now remember, for this one, you take the opposite of this one here, so that'll be x equals negative 1, but you got to put it over that number there, so negative 1/4. Okay? What about this one here, x squared minus 15? Well, let's set it off equal to 0. Off to the side here. This is not a difference of squares, so I need to go ahead and solve using just regular solving methods here. So we're going to go ahead and add 15 to both sides. We get x squared equals 15. Square root both sides. I get x equals plus or minus square root of 15. Now remember our list here. 15 is right before 16, so I would have to divide it by the 9 or the 4, and that's not going to give me a nice whole number. So that means that 15 does not have any perfect squares in it. So my answer would just be the plus or minus square root of 15. So my three solutions would be negative 1/4, positive square root of 15, and negative square root of 15. Okay? So 1, 2, 3 solutions. You guys getting the hang of this? This should be the last one here. Then you have delta math, okay? So let's go ahead and factor the first group here. So I factor out an x squared. I'm left with x minus 2. Always double check your work. X squared times x, is that x cubed? Yes. X squared times negative 2 is negative 2x squared. Yep. Okay. Now here, remember, since it starts with a negative, we're going to put a negative here, and then we're just going to write x minus 2 in the second parentheses there. Okay. So what should I factor out if I want to end up with this here, with x minus 2? Well, just do 15 divided by 1, that's 15, so we can factor out of 15. Okay, again, 15 divided by 1 is 15, so watch. If I distribute here, negative 15 times x, that's going to give me the negative 15x. And does negative 15 times negative 2 equal positive 30? Yes, it does. Okay? And so then we just put x squared minus 15. X squared minus 15 in one parentheses, and then x minus 2 equals 0. Okay? So we have here x squared minus 15 and x minus 2. Let's go ahead and take the opposite of this one. So this will be x equals 2. And then x squared minus 15, let's just set that equal to 0. And let's add 15 here to solve. It's going to be the same as the one we just did here. Okay, so square root both sides. X equals plus or minus square root of 15. Okay, so my three solutions are positive square root of 15, negative square root of 15, and 2. Okay, and that's it.